Well, I immediately, from the beginning of the crisis, I had a feeling that there was something wrong with the mainstream narrative, but I couldn't really indicate what exactly I thought there was wrong. But I started actually, I have a double degree. On the one hand, I'm a professor in clinical psychology, but I also have got a master degree in statistics. And in the beginning of the crisis, I actually started to analyze some figures and some graphs and some statistics on the mortality of the virus, the infection fatality rate, the case fatality rate, and all this kind of stuff. And immediately I noticed that most statistics dramatically overestimated the dangerousness of the virus. And I was not alone. There were several other statisticians, sometimes world famous medical statisticians, such as Ioannidis of Stanford, for instance, who also tried to warn the people and the governments that there was a good possibility that the coronavirus was much less dangerous than most models claimed. But in one way or another, all these dissonant voices did not really have much effect. But for me personally, by the end of May 2020, it was proven beyond doubt that the initial mathematical models overestimated the mortality of the virus. For instance, we all know that the mathematical models that had most impact on the corona measures were probably those issued by Imperial College in London. And these models actually predicted that by the end of May 2020, in a country like Sweden, about 80,000 people would die if the country would not go into lockdown. And the country did not go into lockdown. And by the end of May 2020, the virus claimed about 6,000 people in Sweden, and no more than that, which meant that the models actually overestimated the mortality of the virus by a factor of 15, and so which is huge. And the strangest thing for me was that while the corona measures actually present themselves as measures that are really scientifically based, that are based on mathematical modeling and stuff, the strangest thing is that at the moment it was proven beyond doubt that the initial models overestimated the dangerousness of the virus dramatically. The measures and the approach was not corrected. It just continued as it just continued as in the beginning. And at that moment, for me, that was like a turning point for me. I think I started to take a different perspective then. I switched then from the perspective of a statistician to the perspective of a clinical psychologist. And I started to wonder, like how is it possible that an entire society, even the world population, is going along with a narrative that shows so many absurd characteristics. Another example of an absurd characteristic of the story was that from the beginning of the crisis, institutions such as the United Nations actually warned us that probably more people would die as a cause of starvation or hunger in the developing countries because of the lockdowns than the number of victims the coronavirus could claim, even if no measures were taken at all. So, which meant as much as that the remedy was far worse than the disease in this case. And then still, nobody seemed to notice, and everybody seemed to be focused so much on these corona victims and on the possible damage caused by the coronavirus. That everybody continued, and that people continued to be willing to buy into the story and to go along with the story, which is actually extremely strange. And from then on, like from May 2020 on, I started to try to understand what psychological processes were going on in society, and it took me about 3 or 4 months, I think. It was in August 2020. Because I suddenly felt that I could really hit the nail and that I could say what we are dealing with here is a process of large-scale mass formation. That's what's happening. Mass formation is a specific phenomenon which emerges in a society if a few conditions are met. So there are at least 4 conditions that have to be fulfilled before a large-scale phenomenon of mass formation can emerge. The first and most important condition is that there should be a lack of people experiencing a lack of social bond, a lack of social connectedness. The second condition is that there have to be a lot of people who experience a lack of meaning making. And these two are actually associated to each other. People are humans are social beings, and if they experience a lack of social connectedness, a lack of social bond, they will probably also experience a lack of meaning making. And then the third condition is that there have to be a lot of people who experience a lot of free-floating anxiety. This means anxiety that is not connected to a mental representation. For instance, if you see a lion and you're scared, then you know what you're scared of. Your anxiety in that case is connected to a mental representation. But if it is not connected to a mental representation, you end up in an extremely aversive, negative emotional state in which you deal with the kind of anxiety that you cannot control. So, first condition, lack of social bond. Second condition, lack of meaning making or sense making in life. The third condition, a lot of free-floating anxiety and psychological discontent. And then the fourth condition, a lack of free-floating frustration and aggression. A kind of aggression that is that you feel inside of yourselves, but that you cannot direct or aim at a certain object or cause. So, and then when these conditions are met, something really typical can happen in a society. When under these conditions, a narrative is distributed through the mass media, indicating an object of anxiety, and at the same time providing a strategy to deal with this object of anxiety, then there might be a huge willingness in the population to go along, to participate in the strategy. And why? Because all this free-floating anxiety, which is so hard to control, connects to this object of anxiety. And in this way, that's the first advantage. All this free-floating anxiety is now connected to, to a mental representation. And then, just by participating in the strategy, you can mentally control the object of anxiety. For instance, if a narrative is distributed which says that there is a very dangerous virus and that we should go into lockdown, if these 4 conditions are met, then there might be an extremely extraordinary willingness to participate in the strategy and the lockdowns, even when the narrative in itself is absolutely absurd. So, and what happens is actually something very important. When people start to participate all together in the strategy to deal with the object of anxiety, a new kind of social bond and a new kind of meaning-making emerges, which means that there is like a new kind of solidarity that emerges. And this makes that people switch from a highly aversive, negative mental state of social isolation, interpersonal isolation, to the exact opposite, to the extremely high level of connectedness that exists in a crowd or a mass. So, and then people start a heroic battle with the object of anxiety, which leads to a kind of mental intoxication of connectedness, which is the real reason why people continue to buy into the narrative, even if it's utterly absurd or blatantly wrong. So, it's a kind of a ritual. Attention remains focused on the solidarity and the shared narrative. They will not notice that they are losing the wealth and the well-being of themselves, even their children. People will be able to take it away without the population noticing it. So that's one of the most problematic effects, which was also described when the totalitarian states of the first half of the 20th century emerged in the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany. One of the most striking observations was that in a strange way, all these people seemed to be willing to really sacrifice everything that was precious to them, as if they didn't notice it. And then Stalin, for instance, he liquidated 50% of the members of his own Communist Party. And the strange thing was that these communist leaders even did not object or did not protest. They accepted the death penalty, but as if they admitted that they had done something wrong, but while they actually haven't been doing anything wrong. The strange way in which people are insensitive to personal losses is one of the most striking consequences of mass formation, and also shows that actually mass formation does not lead up, is not that you cannot compare the emotional insensitivity that manifests during mass formation with a kind of ordinary egoism. It's something completely different. People are not egoistic at all in the masses. To the contrary, they are willing to sacrifice all their individual freedom and all their individual advantages in favor of the collective well-being and of this new kind of extreme solidarity. But that difference between totalitarian states and classical dictatorships is something really important. As soon as you understand that, you understand the power of the masses. And so, like in a classical dictatorship, the population obeys the dictator because they are scared of him. That's all. But in a totalitarian state, people are hypnotized by the totalitarian leaders, and they are, in one way or another, this makes that the totalitarian state behaves in a completely different way than a classical dictatorship. For instance, if in a totalitarian state, if in a dictatorship, a classical dictatorship, the opposition is silenced, if there is no opposition anymore in the public space, then usually the dictator becomes milder. He becomes friendlier because he understands that he has to create a positive image in the population in order to remain their leader. In a classical, in a totalitarian state, exactly the opposite happens. As soon as the opposition is silenced, as soon as there is no opposition anymore in the public space, then the totalitarian system becomes really crazy and starts to commit its most absurd atrocities. That was the case in 1930 in the Soviet Union and in 1935 in Nazi Germany, actually. As soon as the opposition was silenced, the totalitarian system becomes, to use the words of Hannah Arendt, it becomes a monster that devours its own children. And then it becomes radically absurd. It starts to destroy everyone, no matter whether they are loyal to the system or not. And so that's something extremely important. The difference between a classical dictatorship and a totalitarian system is extremely important, and it shows us one thing, one central, quintessential thing in this crisis. We have to continue to speak out, because if the opposition is silenced, then the hypnosis will become even deeper than it is now, and then the masses will start to commit atrocities. That's so typical. It has history has shown it time and time again. It's quintessential that people continue to speak out. They will not be able to stop the process of mass formation, but they will prevent the hypnosis to become so deep that atrocities are committed. And I think usually in a process of mass formation, there are three groups. There are always three groups. There is one group, only about 30% of the people is really hypnotized. That's something strange. And also in a totalitarian state, only 30% of the population is really totalitarian. Mm-hmm. Then there is a second group of about 40% who usually does not go against the mass or the crowd. So they follow the crowd, and in that way, there is a group of 70% who is going along with the system or with the masses. And then there is an additional group of about 30% who is also not hypnotized and who tries to speak out or to do something. And that group is extremely heterogeneous. It's of all political backgrounds, of all socioeconomic statuses, of all ethnic groups. It's very hard to define what that group is, this third group. But this third group is usually also about 25 or 30%. So if this group could really unify, as soon as this group is really one group, as soon as this group finds a way to really identify with each other, the crisis is over and the mass formation stops. That's the challenge.
Why are some people apparently not affected by mass formation?
That's a very, very good question. Many people have tried to answer that question, and usually everybody, or most, or almost always, people fail to give a real answer. I think in this crisis, whether you buy into the story or not, whether you're hypnotized or not, has a lot to do with your broader ideological preferences. Like, I feel that most people who really go along with the narrative now and who are really identifying with the narrative have no problem at all with a very mechanistic, biological, reductionist view on man and the world. So I think that most people, for instance, are convinced that vaccines are the best way to boost your immune system, and so on. So I think that most of the people who really go along with the narrative now are people who feel good with the broader ideology, the biological reductionist, even the transhumanist ideology that is seizing the population now. Because I'm convinced that if this process continues, we will end up in a transhumanist society, or they will try to reorganize society according to the ideals and the principles of transhumanism. The level of intelligence, for instance, highly educated and highly intelligent people become exactly as intelligent as everybody else in the masses. That's something very, very typical for mass formation, that everybody becomes equally intelligent, which usually means extremely stupid in the masses. And people, as soon as someone is seized by mass formation, he usually loses all capacity for critical and rational thinking. To be honest, I think it will be quite difficult to avoid ending up in a kind of a new totalitarianism. But it will be a new totalitarianism. It will be, on the one hand, the same as the old totalitarianism of the first half of the 20th century, but it will always be radically different because it will be a worldwide totalitarian system. It will not have external enemies. It will only have internal enemies, and it will treat these internal enemies in a different way as the external enemies were treated. That's something that is really typical for the logic of totalitarian systems. Totalitarian systems need an enemy. Without an enemy, they collapse. So I think that there is a good chance that the new totalitarian system will tolerate the existence of the enemies, but it will marginalize them, push them outside of mainstream society. That's one of the things that I think will be hard to avoid. The more absurd a narrative is, the better it functions as a ritual. That's the drama of totalitarianism. Like our prime minister 2 days ago said in the news that actually this pandemic was a pandemic of the non-vaccinated, and that they had to stop to put the vaccinated at risk. So totalitarianism and mass formation always ends up destroying itself. So the self-destructive character of mass formation and totalitarianism is something that has been observed and described by all scholars that study the phenomenon. So on the one hand, so if we think about the best strategy to deal with the situation, then we should be aware that we are dealing with an extremely strong enemy, but an enemy who will always destroy himself. So the only thing we have to do is we have to make sure that our story continues to be present in public space, and that we survive for a few years. That are realistic goals, and we never should try to beat the enemy, because the enemy can only be beaten by himself. That's something that really, you can explain it psychologically in a very nice and convincing way why the masses and totalitarianism or always self-destructive. And as soon as you realize that the only thing you have to do is to continue to speak and to make sure that in one way or another, you can survive outside of the system. These two things. And then you can quietly wait until totalitarianism destroys itself. But of course, I don't say that it will be easy, but that is the strategy to deal with it, and I'm sure that it will work. And you will see that the small group will survive, and that in one way or another, after the collapse, it will play an important role, I think, in the rebuilding of a society according to new and more human, more ethical principles.